Now, this episode of Archipiélago Histórico is brought to you by Tabaco La Altura, making Puerto Rican puros. Tabaco La Altura is a premium cigar company dedicated to making 100% Puerto Rican cigars, puros. Now, you probably heard about Nicaraguan, Dominican, Ecuadorian, Colombian, even Brazilian, but have you heard about Puerto Rican puros? Well, now you have the chance to try one made by Tabaco La Altura. Tabaco La Altura grows its tobacco in Lares, Puerto Rico, which is a mountain area. It's a very rich flavor, very nice. I love them, and I think you should try them as well. Tabaco La Altura is making Puerto Rican puros, which is something that hasn't been done in a long time. Now you finally have the chance to do that, and I think that you will absolutely love them. For more information about Tabaco La Altura, visit them on Facebook at Tabaco La Altura or at Tabaco La Altura on Instagram. Remember that tobacco consumption must be responsible and taking your health into consideration. Thank you, Tabaco La Altura, for sponsoring this episode of Archipiélago Histórico. Hello, everyone. This is Ramón González-Arango López, and I'm a public historian from Puerto Rico. In this episode of Archipiélago Histórico, I will be having a conversation with Dr. Margo Groenewoud. Please explain how to. I tried my best to pronounce your name. How is it?
You did wonderful. It's Groenewoud. It's Dutch, and it means greenwood. So most people in the US would say Groenwood.
So, for the people that don't know about your work, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself and what your topics of interest are?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you, Ramon, for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here in this audience on this platform, and that brings me directly to what my work is all about. As we all know, the Dutch Caribbean are very often overlooked or sort of regarded as different or whatever relative to Caribbean studies. And I started doing research on Curaçao about 10 years ago. I'm sort of a later in life academic. And I started doing research on Curaçao, on the influence of the Catholic Church on social development in Curaçao in the post-slavery period, or actually in the 20th century. So I picked up at the moment that the oil refinery was established on Curaçao and modernization came, many migrants, etc. And that we will talk more about that research, I'm sure, in this podcast. So I'll leave it at that. But following that, in the past year, 1.5 years, I've expanded my work to the wider Caribbean to see, what was going on, in particular between the Dutch and the Spanish-speaking islands. I'm now based in New York, just sort of finishing up this month a full year of being the Fulbright Scholar in Residence at the Dominican Studies Institute here at City College in New York. So my focus is now very much on the Dominican relations with the Dutch Caribbean. But I'm just waiting to go to Centro and to also and to Puerto Rico, of course, and involve Puerto Rico and Cuba in that study as well. So my interests are social exclusion, citizenship, intellectual history, heritage. I do things about digital humanities more on a strategic level. So it's quite diverse, but it all neatly fits together in a puzzle that gets better and better.
Right. We share a lot of interest, and just to clarify, when you say Dominican, do you mean the Dominican Republic or Dominica, the island on the
Yeah,
Lesser
good question. The
Antilles?
Dominican Republic. Yes, the Dominican Republic. And of course, when
Oh,
you do
okay.
Dominican Republic, you do Haiti. It's
Yes, of course. Okay, so let's talk about the Dutch Caribbean, because as you said, it is often an overlooked part of the Caribbean because of mostly linguistic differences. And I think that's the case also with, for instance, Belize, which is a English speaking country in the middle of Central America, surrounded by Spanish speaking countries. It creates dynamics of isolation, seclusion, and that, you know, even though they have a lot of similarities in their cultures, having Mayan communities in Guatemala, Honduras, and all those places, it really does isolate them. So when it comes to the
Mhm.
Dutch Caribbean, can you please tell us more about them? I mean, I think there are 6 because I read your article, and previously I used to think that it was just Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao, but it turns out that there's 6. So can you please tell me what those are?
Yeah, it's so interesting that you tell me that, because being here in the US for a year, I've heard so much. So I could write an article about that in itself. I wrote something in small x on the erasure, going a bit beyond the linguistic elements, but going back to just the basics, the Dutch Caribbean. Um, the Dutch in the 20th century. So let's start at the beginning of the 20th century. There were 6 islands and Dutch Guyana, Suriname. Suriname also
Oh,
was
okay.
part of the Dutch Caribbean, though the laws and the setup was different. Suriname had a plantation economy, um, and the islands did not. So there are several differences, but the 6 islands, indeed, there are these 3 that you mentioned, close to the coast of Venezuela: Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao. Curaçao also being the center, the governmental center of the Dutch Caribbean for a very long time, the largest island, and dominant in many regards, and dominating. Um,
Hmm.
and then there are 3 more islands, the Windward Islands, Saint Martin, which is the Dutch part of the island of Saint Martin. So there's one island with 2 parts, French and a Dutch part. There's Saba and there's Saint Eustatius. Saint Eustatius being important throughout the history of the United States, for several reasons. For instance, if you read Barbara Tuchman's The First Salute, it opens with Saint Eustatius as the Golden Rock. And these were English-speaking islands, and they were, in many regards, very much always in contact with their environment, with the British islands. So very often, if you meet people from St. Kitts, they would say there's family
Mhm.
from St. Eustatius, vice versa. And that's an interesting, very interesting topic that not much has been published on. And even though that wasn't my intention, I am working much
Mhm.
more on the English-speaking Dutch islands in that environment. Because, for instance, in the Dominican Republic and in Cuba, on the sugar fields, in Panama, for the canal,
Mhm.
people working there mostly were not Dutch speaking, but English speaking. Not all of them, many also came from the other islands, but the majority. And these people, of course, blended in beautifully in the larger English speaking Caribbean communities there. Um, so to understand relations between islands, I think you need to, and I'm not the only one, of course. People like Lara Putnam wrote beautiful studies doing the same thing, looking at the sort of bottom up, having a bottom up perspective, not so much the geopolitical, but what were people doing? Why were they moving? Did they come back? Yes or no?
Hmm.
Why? What was it like for people themselves? that's sort of the perspective by which I look at these islands. And in the past, very often, for valid reasons, studies have been written more on a geopolitical level, and as everywhere. And then, of course, the emphasis is on Curacao and somewhat on Aruba, because there was a refinery there as well, an oil refinery, an American oil refinery, starting 1928, the one in Curaçao in 1918, attracting many migrants. So many people know Aruba and Curaçao because of that. And very often it's just Curaçao being the governmental center and the dominant island. But that's the fuller picture. Historically,
a lot of Puerto Ricans actually.
There's a lot to say about what the current situation is in the Kingdom of the Netherlands. It's very confusing. People ask me if I'm a citizen of Curaçao or of the Netherlands, and honestly, I don't have an answer to that, and that's weird.
All right,
because
so
I do have a
let's
Dutch
expand
passport,
a little bit on
but
that.
I have voting rights in Curaçao, and I pay my taxes in Curaçao, so I'm a resident of Curaçao. So I'm a Curaçaoan citizen with a Dutch passport, like everyone there. But what's my citizenship? Is it Dutch or is it Curaçao? It's mixed. It's really unique.
It's being debated there. Where are we?
There's a unique situation where there's the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and that comprises of the country of the Netherlands in Europe, the country of Aruba, the country of St. Martin, and the country of Curaçao, all having their own level of autonomy and democracy, their own banking, and you name it, except for like defense or giving out passports. That's still done in The Hague, of course. And should there be a war, of course, the Netherlands, we don't have an army. So these things are still on a kingdom level, but most things in the countries, like Curaçao, are taken care of in the countries themselves. And for the other smaller islands, Bonaire, St. Eustatius, and Ceiba, they became special municipalities of the Netherlands in 2010. And I think it's valid to say that in many regards that implied, with all good intentions, some level of recolonization. And I'm sorry for laughing. It's a very serious issue, of course. I didn't mean to be funny about that.
No, of course. I completely understand.
And coming from Puerto Rico, you know all about this.
I know exactly what you're talking about. We have that sort of let's say weird relationship you're making a reference to, but it's very complicated. But I'm gonna be more abrupt in how I describe Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is simply a colony of the United States. It's black and white. There's nothing in between. There's no special attributes to it. It's a modern day colony of the United States. That's it. There's no way. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. That's how it is.
Yeah.
But it is interesting to me that you mentioned the oil refinery in Curaçao, because I've known many people who had relatives in Puerto Rico who went there to work, and it used to be a popular place for skilled laborers like welders and people like that who went there, make good money, and then came back to the island and kept on living. Can you please tell us more about the beginning of Dutch colonization of the Caribbean?
That goes back, I didn't prepare that, so I don't have all the dates, but that goes back to the early 17th century. What happened was that even before there was some sort of an infrastructure, there were many merchants originating from the Netherlands already in the Atlantic, active in the Atlantic. They also were active in New York, and they brought people from the islands to New York, etc. So that was going on in the late 16th century. And then in 1621, I do have the date, the West Indian Company was established with some, locations. Curaçao being the central location where the central sort of government was. There was the New Netherlands, which is now New Amsterdam, which is now New York, and later on it was traded for Suriname. So Suriname became then also part of the sort of the scope of the West Indian Company. So it was never a sort of colonization aimed at settling. It was very commercial from the beginning onwards. And then you had all the wars and the changes of the islands, and we won't go through this. But this is how the Dutch arrived here, through being merchants, being very active in that field. And what made a big difference, I think, for the development of the Caribbean and for understanding relations within the Caribbean is the arrival of the Jewish families, the Sephardic Jews, who were sort of invited to take part in the local trade and also the Atlantic trade. And these first families arrived in the 17th century and then started to sort of expand, so that many of the names of Jewish Sephardic Caribbean families like Maduro, Curiel, you see them everywhere, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico. This is a network that can be traced back and to there's a Goldberg, Josette Goldberg wrote a beautiful story about that, with the Jews in the Caribbean, tracing back all, this sort of network of Jewish families, all back to this core of first, I think it was nine families that arrived in Curaçao. Curaçao still has the oldest functioning Sephardic synagogue in the Western Hemisphere. There's a lot of research going on around that too. Beautiful archive. So yeah, that's sort of sets the scene, I think, for the Dutch in the Caribbean.
Right. So it is my understanding that originally the Spaniards occupied Curaçao, and they didn't have a lot of interest in it, because we have to understand that Spaniards came primarily to what they understood as a new world, looking for gold, looking for what's this other plata? I forget the. It's not steel. It's
Silver.
Silver. Yes. Silver. So silver.
If you
gold,
know papiamento,
and,
you know Spanish.
yeah, I was gonna ask you about that eventually. Yes. But going back to that, the Spaniards, it is my understanding that they described the island of Curaçao as una isla inútil, like it's worthless, because it doesn't have these things that we're looking for, which is steel, which is silver and gold. So yes, you mentioned papiamento, which is a mixture of Portuguese and something else. I believe it's probably Dutch. Can you tell us more about that? Because I don't know a lot about it.
Yes, I just briefly about the Spaniards. It's not that they came and they left. They had a big influence on the development on the islands by taking away the indigenous population then residing on the islands. These were Caquetillo mostly that resided there. So I cannot not mention that. They brought mostly to what they called La Española. And the papiamento is thank you for that question. It's the most loved and I think the most binding cultural elements of the three islands, and it's beautiful for many reasons, but mostly because it is a mixture of Guinea, There's Guinea in there, so from originating from Africa. There's Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, English, a little French. We say bon appetit, or petit pois. Don't ask me why, but there's some French in there as well. Of course, there were French people, but why would they leave us with petit pois and bon appetit, except for their love for food? I don't know. But yeah, it's a mixture, and it's the most impressive things is that socially it was binding through all classes. So the elite, the Jewish, all the way to communication with the enslaved was in Papiamento. So it's different than most Creole languages originating from plantation, economy settings, where these were the languages of the oppressed and were very often forbidden. Even today, like I know from Suriname, Sranang Tongo, some people just don't consider it something to be proud of to speak the language, or they don't want their kids to become too much depending on that language. It still echoes. And that's not the case in Papiamento. Of course, we have discussions about the language and whether it's a good idea to have kids depending too much on that language, and because it limits themselves in a more global when they have global ambitions for study or work. But in its core, it's a very important element of the whole of society, of the community, of culture on the islands.
Okay, I want to see what it sounds like. So let's see if one day maybe I have the opportunity to visit the islands and see and hear for myself how it sounds.
It's last Tuesday I was here in New York in a classroom. As part of the global classroom, and we listened to Mi País, a video by a song by Isaline Callister with a beautiful video. And we asked the kids there what they recognized. And for instance, the song starts with Mi país está un lugar chiquito. Well, with un historia rico. Now, you know Papiamento, don't you? You understand this or not?
I totally understood everything you said. Yeah,
I
totally got it.
Yeah, yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so let's talk about the topic of discussion today. You sent me an article, and when we were having discussions about collaborating on this space and this platform, you told me that you have many interests, and when you said when you talked about your interest in Curaçao specifically, I said, okay, this is the theme that I want to touch on the podcast, because I have a lot of content already about Puerto Rico, about other places in the Caribbean. And there are not a lot of resources, at least for me at the moment. I don't have a lot of contacts that focus on the Dutch Caribbean. So it was very important to me to do this as opposed to other topics. We could do those later, but this is very important to me and for my audience right now, which hasn't been exposed to anything relating to the Dutch Caribbean. So you sent me an article titled Social Exclusion and the Entanglement of State, Religion, and Civil Society in Mid-20th Century Curaçao. What made you study this specifically?
Yes, I was born and raised in the Netherlands, and I moved to Curaçao in 2008. And it struck me directly how Catholic the island was in so many regards, so much in the public's, sphere, everywhere. And then people would say, why are you so fascinated by that? Because, of course, we're so close to Latin America. And then I would say, well, but Suriname is in Latin America, and Suriname is not Catholic. So that was part of why I wanted to study this more. So the why the relationship of the Catholic mission? Also because the Netherlands is a Protestant country, And what struck me was that there were no signs of, for instance, the liberation theology movement, um, and and going to church, and you always go to church when you're on the islands because you know people that have kids that do their Holy Communion or whatever. It's sort of well, of course, no one forces you to, but it's inescapable. And then it felt so so specific, so unique, the whole setting of Catholicism. And I know about this. I know about syncretism. I know about creolization, transculturalization. You know, I could contextualize that to a certain point, but not in a colonial context. And then there is the study of Rosemary Allen, Professor Rosemary Allen, who from Curaçao, who studied as an anthropologist the post-slavery decades up until the industrialization, and she pointed at the role of the Catholic mission on the island as very important for people, and making that distinction, you know, their level of compliance to the Catholic way of life really mattered for the level of opportunity. Like if you would you were living close to a church, and you would be married, and you would be part of, you know, a good Catholic family, then you would have the opportunity to be going to a better school, or getting a plot of land, or being helped. But for single mothers having children from several men, which is quite common on the islands because of migration, the situation appeared to be different. There was a lot of normalization, not normalization, but restrictions based on Catholic norms and values, still palpable, you know, still on the island. So I started studying this just to see how the influence was of the Catholic Church on social development, and from there once I was getting a better idea about this, and then having the 1940s with the first anti-colonialism, then, you know, decoloniality in that mid-40s happening everywhere in the Caribbean. Of course, I started to look at citizenship, because if you have a religion that keeps the majority of your population at distance from social mobility, which was what I claim in my study, then of course that influences where that community, where that society is at the point that which happened in the late 1940s, when you start to build a democracy in that what's then supposedly a former colony. And that happened in 1948 with universal suffrage being implemented, the formation of a new country, the Netherlands Antilles, consisting of the 6 islands we mentioned before. And that asks a lot of your former subjects when you become a citizen in a parliamentary democracy that is modeled on the Netherlands in Europe. And the Netherlands in Europe has a civil society which developed throughout centuries. And that's not the case in Curaçao, where the Catholic Church was brought in the 1870s formally. Before that, they were there, but there was this formal role for Catholic missions, for the Order of the Dominican Fathers specifically, to take care of the Afro-Curaçaoan population. And that meant that they would do education and medical care, all sorts of welfare, in a way that was patronizing and going beyond, there was there were no or very limited elements of empowerment and agency in that the way that was structured. So of course I moved my focus to social exclusion, which is still visible in the island, and to citizenship, and how that was, like the title of my article, how that was all entangled with the role of religion, and in particular with the Catholic Missionary Church on the island. So that's sort of the way the article developed. Yeah.
There is something that caught your attention that you talk about in the beginning of the article that also caught my attention, and that thing is, how is it possible that you have a Protestant country, but somehow you have the Catholic Church being able and being led, the Netherlands told them, okay, yes, you can go to Aruba, you can indoctrinate people, you can educate them, you can control the society of Curaçao. How is it that this happens when you have two different religions? And for those people that don't know, the Netherlands is the majority of the country is Protestant.
Yeah. Well, two things happened. One thing happened in Europe itself, where the Catholic Church in the later 19th century, like everywhere in the world, wanted to expand and to strengthen. So you had all sorts of things happening for them. So they were keen on doing missionary work. It was even so that, and you need to picture Europe and see the big Catholic countries like France and Spain and Portugal, and then see the Netherlands, which is a tiny country, and then think that at the high point of missionary work, I think it was calculated in 1912, 1920, at the high point of mission of the missionary, work worldwide. 12% of all religious people worldwide in the missions were from the Netherlands. So that says something about their ambition and their readiness to do missionary work. So that happened in the Netherlands. What happened on the islands was that after the abolition of slavery, the islands were really a concern because of the lack of natural resources, of economic opportunities, except for merchants, but that was taken care of already. So there was a big concern. So what do we do now with the islands? And there was a new law established in 1865 for both Suriname and the islands. And there it was agreed that Suriname would have a Protestant mission, and Curaçao and the islands would have Catholic mission. So that was formalized. It wasn't something that just organically grew. Of course, there had been missionaries coming from the terra firma for ages, so there had been some. It wasn't a mission in a sense, in the true sense of coming to the heathens and baptize them and introduce Christianity. That wasn't necessary. But what was necessary, and that was where the win-win started, was to take care of the people that that were. Yeah, it was a difficult situation, and having the missionaries there and then making formalizing and expanding their role, that was vital for the Dutch government to have the population taken care of, and that's a way of pacifying, of course, the population in a way that was, and of course the Dutch loved that, in a way that was very cost efficient, because you can there is the religious ords invested a lot in that. they invested with people, with money. So were big investments on the islands. But as the missions grew, there was a lot of money flowing back. So the Dominican mission in Puerto Rico was established in a later date, and that was fully funded. I cannot help mentioning this, by the Dutch mission. And that Dutch mission, Catholic mission, was sponsored by the government, who would just pay for education and things like that in the regular way. So a father or a priest, they would be receiving a full salary, just like another teacher or another government official, or the rabbi for that sake. And then that was a lot of money if you look at the way that the church works, with having priests living very simple, all together in one house. They have one cook, so it's very cost efficient. So they share the car. It was very cost efficient in many regards. So there was a lot of money paid or earned there. And that, so there was a power position, there was a financial position that really, is crucial to know if you want to understand why this lasted so long, because it took the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s to end this construct.
To end,
I don't know where we started with what question I was answering, but that's sort of the basics.
Right. I want to know how come the Catholic Church exerted so much control on Curaçao when Curaçao was part of the Netherlands, and the Netherlands is a Protestant country.
Yeah, the church is a big word, so it wasn't like everyone in the church was having control. It's like subcontracting. I think that's the easiest way to explain the mission. I'm a Protestant, so I need easy explanations for this. It's like subcontracting, and then so it was just a task given to the religious order of the Dominican Fathers, which is a very intellectual and not a very practical religious order. So that's interesting as well. And they would subcontract their work to other religious orders, making money in that process as well. So there was this almost business-like organization, and I don't want to take away from the hard work done by individual priests, all the hardships. Of course, I may sound a bit cold or a bit cynical or critical, because from the colonial power structure viewpoint, there is all reason to question and to be critical. But at the same time, on a more humanistic level, of course, people came from with very little knowledge to these islands. It must have been terrible, and they just gave their lives for the mission, and I want to mention that as well.
That is a great point. That it could also be used for Spaniards, because we criticize them a lot when it comes to colonization of the Americas and so on. But at the same time, you have to understand that a lot of these people that came to what they call the New World were essentially medieval people with medieval minds, with a view of the world that wasn't compatible with what was on the other side of the ocean. And yes, a lot of the things a lot of these people did was bad, was wrong, and it's condemnable. But at the same time, you have to understand that they didn't necessarily saw themselves as evil. They were merely acting how they knew. I mean, this is not to justify their doings, not at all. But it is essentially, I'm saying the same thing you're saying. We need to understand And instead of going right away to let's just condemn them all, let's just be against the Spaniards or the Dutch or whoever came to the New World to colonize, there's a lot of bad things, but at the same time, you have to understand the historical context of what's going on and why it is occurring that way.
Yeah, and making the distinctions between the elite who was in power, and I'm now studying how, for instance, the Catholic elite was involved in activities during the Trujillo regime in the Dominican Republic. That's a whole different situation than individuals, being just doing their work, organizing the Christmas party in some barrio. Those are different levels, of course. You need in contextualizing to distinguish, because there were people who were, I think, doing very consciously, doing very bad things. Yeah.
In your article, you introduce, at least to me, a term, oikos. What does that mean?
Yeah, oikos is a term that I didn't invent in this context myself. It's a very well-known anthropologist, Iteke Witteveen on the island, with Jonchi Weber, who did a lot of anthropology. There, they coined this, and it's a Greek word, and it's the Greek word for a smaller community, which is not so much self-sufficient, but there's a lot of agency in the community, a lot of mutual support. You could say it's a microcosm in a sense. And they coined this word, and I love it, because when you first, with a European view, when I first started, getting to know the island, you do see a lot of non-sharing, a lot of isolated communities within a larger communities, or sort of you try to search for where's the collective here and what's the individual. It was for me hard to sort of figure out, and also to see, because of this, but now I'm jumping to the conclusion of my article, but because you don't recognize that level of organization in between individual and the government, which we tend to call civil society. The way you know it in Europe, the way you know it, for instance, in the US, this civil society level where people do things for the common good, etc. It's so different on the islands, and I try to grasp that. And sometimes you see very strong mutual relations, for instance, surrounding death, how everyone supports people, in food, for instance, in the sharing of food. But then you get this sense of it's not random, but what's then the community? It's not fixed communities like this barrio or this family. It can be some people of a family with some other people from another family that have this mutuality, that form some sort of a oikos. And I really, though I'm not an anthropologist and I never followed up on that too much, I used that in my study to enrich the picture of, yes, there is a lack of the formation of citizenship in a civil society context. Yes, that's true. At the same time, there were these smaller communities in which people were doing things that were not just for their individual sake, but for a collective sake. So that's how I introduced that word and why.
I have another question for you regarding the African descendants which inhabit the island of Curaçao. So you're saying that these islands didn't necessarily have a plantation economy. Then what was the driving factor behind the importation? And notice that I'm using this word very carefully. because again, you need to
Yes.
understand the historical context, and this is for the audience to understand the historical context. What makes
Yeah.
the colonial authorities of Curaçao bring so many people from Africa if you didn't have plantations you didn't have these big scale plantations as opposed to other places in the New World?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, to understand that, you have to realize that Curacao was not just on the receiving end. It wasn't of enslaved people for labor. They were,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know the word, an asiento, a seat, sort of
Oh
a hub,
yes,
I think is a
yes,
good word.
asiento.
Um, yes, and so there were both people that indeed were stayed at the island to become like doing work in plantations. We did have smaller plantations. It wasn't a plantation economy, but that's not to say that there were no
Right.
plantations, but there were smaller plantations. There were also what's called the company enslaved. So the people that the government, the West Indische Compagnie, the West Indian Company, um, uh, enslaved, or for used as laborers, and then there were people who were in transit, but also people who were supposed to be in transit, but for whatever reason um, stayed on the island. For instance, because there was an illness or an handy, something like they lost a leg or something, and
Mm.
yeah, and that's a very cruel, sad part of Curacao history. It's it was there that it was decided if there was anything wrong, um, uh, 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 which made someone less, likely to be sold, and then people stayed on the island because of that, and that could even be things like boldness, or it's not like you don't have arms so you can't work. It was it Yeah, these are the very cruel and sad parts of of what happened on Curacao.
In the beginning of our conversation, you said that a lot of times the Dutch Antilles, the Dutch Caribbean, is overlooked, and I agree with that. But at the same time, it seems to me that we do have a lot in common despite our linguistic differences. Because when you talk about the paternalistic um, sense of the church in Curaçao, and when you talk about how in their discourse characterize the black community or the black population of the island as childs or actually children, uh, that does happen in other places in the Caribbean. In Puerto Rico, you have that same characterization being used to describe the Jíbaro, which, as I'm sure you know, is the rural peoples, the campesinado, the campesino. And so that immediately
The
gets my
Pueblo,
attention
yeah.
that, yeah, again and again, we see how colonial powers create this discourse that these are children. Therefore, they need to be controlled. They need to be led. So talk to us more about how that happened in Curaçao, that paternalistic
Yeah,
and
thank you for that question. It has.
hmm,
I wrote an article about this in Small X that I'd like to refer to for people who might be interested in this,
hmm.
which was part intellectual history, part a personal essay, a personal sort of first reflection uh, of myself, in which I ventured beyond that sort of obvious language thing, because there must be more. And what I would like to state first of all, is that people like Gert Oost-Indie, Alex van Stipriaan, many Dutch colleagues who did study, and people from Curacao, like Rosemary Allen, Richnel Ansano, people like Peter Verton. There are so many people who wrote in English about the Dutch Caribbean. So there is something else than availability also. It's not just language. There's something else than availability also. And I don't mean to blame people who say, well, I did what I, it's there must be something else. And the way that I wanted to start this study is to look at the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s mostly, 60s also, when so much happened in the Caribbean, in particular, people like Eric Williams, George Lemming, who were very focused on, looking at the Caribbean as a whole. And Eric Williams himself, he really started writing a history of the Caribbean with the intention to include everyone and everything. And I went to his archives in St. Augustine, Trinidad, the UWI archives, and I found some very interesting, not much, but some references to him doing work on that, working on towards that publication, letters to the publisher. And in all of these, he made the connection between the Dutch and Puerto Rico, stating that they were the pioneers. They were so much, better off than the other ones. And that's a notion that really is something that you find on the Dutch Caribbean itself also. We're okay. We're not really connected to the Caribbean, very focused. Of course, this is part of the island, focused on the Netherlands and being different. And so I looked at the intellectual production in these decades by people from the islands, mostly Curaçao. And I looked at their, whether they were making the connection then, whether they traveled the islands, because then you get a grasp of, people started to connect, like Eric Williams, like Lemming. People started to connect, and were the Dutch Caribbean doing that also or not? Because then you get a sense of your camera is away. Should I continue talking or not?
Yes.
Yes.
I can
Okay.
hear it. It's gonna be
You
okay.
still hear me? Okay. Yeah. So what I studied was did people from the Dutch Caribbean themselves add to the discourse, be part of this formation of Caribbean history, historiography, things like that. And I conclude that in these years, the self-image and the image really also added to that being different. So it's something that we do ourselves, and we have ourselves added to, being excluded. At the same time, if you look, and you mentioned some things, but if you look at what happened in these decades, for instance, with the National Party of Curaçao making an effort of people education on a massive scale. So going door to door, having this thing going on with the pueblo or the campesinos or whatever you call them, to educate them about and self-educate them and create a sense of pride, and educate them about, there's something like in democracy and you will soon have voting rights. What does that mean? And etc. And that was even before Eric Williams, what's it called? University of Woodson Square, something in Trinidad. He did the same thing in the 50s. And then in the Dominican Republic, Juan Bosch again does the same thing. So Eric Williams mentioning Puerto Rico, these activities. There are so many, like you said, so many interesting things going on in the Caribbean in which the Dutch, had the same experience. So they're not that different, but they stood aside themselves also. And I think it helps to know that, to understand the later connections that were made, and the slow connections. And even today, the often, connections not being made.
I believe that the Caribbean should start seeing itself as an independent region where it is no longer the periphery of Europe and, more recently the United States. Because what we're talking about here is a sense of inferiority that is instilled in the population of these islands and places in the Caribbean through colonization. So, for instance, you have Curaçao, where people look at the Netherlands and don't necessarily look at what's around them, even though there is communication and relationship with people from neighboring countries and islands. The center of power and what they look at for power and what to be led by is the Netherlands. In Puerto Rico, it is the United States. In Martinique, it is France. But I think that is the heritage of colonization, and we as Caribbean people need to start seeing our region as independent and starting, even though there is what I call a nominal autonomy, we need to strive for more, for independence, for a sense of this is my history, this is my heritage as a colonized country or whatever. But now we're gonna take the reins of our destiny and act according to our own interests. So I think that a lot of what we're talking about today is nothing more than the heritage of colonization, which needs to be break with.
I feel you and I hear you. Yeah, in the case of the Dutch Caribbean, what I think is very important is that sort of tipping point towards independence or sovereignty or whatever it is, and it's a mental thing. Should be helped, I think. Or yeah, there's a sort of continuity lacking of having a new movement, which really made a change.
Mm-hmm.
Having a new person that really, we do have people, and more. I'm currently doing some work on Garveyism, for instance. We do have people who did a lot of things in resisting coloniality, but we don't have a hero that really pushed a movement which really transformed to a new state of being. Like, for instance, Moises da Costa Gomes, he came close. He was very important for defining the sort of legal framework for the Netherlands Antilles. But then, through very clever coalition, he was pushed out of government even before they really started, and it was the old establishment again in power. And that's the same what happened in 1969. Yes, there was violence on the island. There was this what's called a revolt. I have a bit of difficulties with what's the correct word. I usually say violence eruption or something like that. and I have difficulties with calling it a revolt or a revolution or whatever, because I don't see the sort of ideology that's shifted into a new movement afterwards. The more long term, continuous force leading to a new state of something, of power or whatever, is lacking. And that's not to say it is not important or whatever. It's super important and courageous and whatever, and very understandable, late in many regards. But the thing is, did things really change? Of course, things change, but not not in the core of power relations, and a lack of continuity there, I think, makes it very hard for people now to relate to something and to want to join a bandwagon. So I applaud you on your, on where you are, and your idealism. I'm not cynical, because I don't want to be cynical and don't intend to be cynical. I think if you want a Caribbean movement, you really need to look at these, as a historian, at these continuities and the lack of continuity. So where are your, how do you make people relate these concepts, these points on the horizon, to points in their current life and points in their history? What's the connection there? Very often, unfortunately, I think children, young people are very much living in sort of day-to-day survival mode, and not in a mode that connects their past to their future.
Right. Yes, we keep talking about that often here in this podcast. I've mentioned several times a Cuban movie called Memorias del Subdesarrollo, in which a comment is made that Cubans are so preoccupied with their present, with their survivability, that it makes it hard for them to see the future and to see what it is they want the country to become and to move forward and progress. I think that also can be extrapolated to other parts of the Caribbean. But I think it is spaces like this where we can see our histories, compare them, and see where we might want to go in the future. But what it seems to me that we have a lot in common and not the other way around. So even though we might have linguistic differences, I think we all share a colonial past that needs to be fought. It needs to, we need to push back, and we need to see how we start becoming, I don't know how to say this, take control of our own region, as opposed to let other people in other countries outside our region take control of it for us. Something I want to touch on that's very important that you're working on is the Digital Library of the Caribbean. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, I'd love to. Thank you for that question. When I moved to the Caribbean, I was working in the university library, and the digital library was very young then, and I made the connection in 2008. So that we have a long history together. And the Digital Library of the Caribbean was funded originally by I think Mellon Foundation. I don't know, but by a big foundation that required them to work from Florida with the Caribbean, and the Caribbean was also involved in the establishment. The idea came from the University Library of the Virgin Islands, if I'm correct. Haiti was involved, so it was truly, it was something from the Caribbean for the Caribbean. And the idea of DLOC is to have this platform in which it's very easy to find sources relative to the Caribbean that can be digitized newspapers, pictures, whatever, but also to add sources as a partner institute. And DLOC, right from the start, always understood the Caribbean, spoke the language of Caribbean institutes, which I think has been key to their success. Very often in digital humanities, you see it's either like big mega projects, which you cannot do as a small Caribbean institute like Radio Haiti, which Duke University did, or it's very bottom up, very community based, like the wonderful work by Schuiler Esprit in Dominica. And what's in between, and in between is very often that the smaller organizations, they just use opportunities they have when they pass by to work on digitization. And the digital Library of the Caribbean still is a partner for everyone, for big and small. You can upload things, and it's not like when you choose for them, you choose against that other platform that you developed. And that's a wonderful thing. So, for instance, the University Library of Curaçao developed their own platform, the Dutch Caribbean Digital Platform. But material from there is also in DLOC. Same for Manioc. That's a wonderful repository for the French Caribbean. Manioc is a partner of DLOC. So material from Manioc can also be found in the Digital Library of the Caribbean. So for people who don't know it, there are 3 opportunities, I think. First is to get to know it, to take a look, browse around, see what they have. Second opportunity is that right now there are many workshops being offered. So join that wagon, subscribe for the newsletter, follow them in social media, and get to learn the platform better. They will also be present at Aquí for those people, or many other Caribbean conferences. I think most often also at CSA. And the third opportunity is that there is a Mellon grant for revitalizing the DLOC, which is not a luxury when you are a digital platform that exists for almost 20 years now. And as part of that revitalization program, there are several, oldies like myself who are now asked to be a little more than just an ambassador. I think the formal term is a consultant, and bring, help partners step up. So going back to step up their game and being more sort of program based. Very often digitization of sources is ad hoc, and you need movements like DLOC and investors like Mellon to take these moments to see at all these ad hoc products and see where the common ground is, and promote the use more. So there's a lot going on there. And thanks again for that question, because in looking at the Caribbean as a whole, I think DLOC is doing a great job.
It is, and I think it is a great platform. It has a lot of potential for different types of research, because I've looked around and you can see that there's books of, letters from the 19th century, magazines from, 1977 or whatever you want to find. I think chances are it is probably available through the Digital Library of the Caribbean. So I think DLOC, which is another way to call it, I think my audience, you would probably benefit from looking what's in there, and I think it has a lot of potential for academics as well. So that's I will find a way to maybe collaborate with them and see what what they're, what programs they offer, as you're mentioning right now. But I'm interested in. Do you know if they have some webinars or stuff like that going on right now? That would be great.
Yes, they have, and I would like to mention also that I'm currently based in New York. I'm there on a like I said, on scholarship, and my host institute is the
Yes.
Dominican Studies Institute. And as part of what I'm doing there, together with the library of the famous library of the Dominican Studies Institute, we organized a seminar last week on the 2nd of May on digital humanities, and DLOG and another initiative, the Caribbean Digital Scholar Collective, presented their work there and also their practical opportunities, like smaller funds for developing educational material, which is now going on in DLOG. And that seminar will be online shortly. So that's something to yeah, and I think I will share that in my social media. If you want to repost that as well, then
Of course.
that's also nice to get an overview of what's going on. And the perspective of that seminar was a transnational future, and that relates to partly to well, at least for me as an organizer, it originated with the article that Lara Putnam wrote about how a transnational historiography developed at the same time that digital humanities developed in the past 15 years. And that's no coincidence. It's easier to let go of your national focus and to look at the neighbors in a digital world. But of course, there are pros and cons, and this was a wonderful, if I may say so myself, a day full of conversations about this from both a user perspective, a scholarly perspective. We ended with a panel with graduate students. I don't know exactly the audience of your podcast, but that was really, for me, that was really the one of several wow moments to hear young scholars speak about their experience with digital sources and digital humanities in Caribbean studies. So that's recommended
There,
as well.
yes, there are scholars that listen to this podcast, but this podcast is primarily made for the public, the general public, for people who, regardless of their educational level, they have access to this. They have access to this in an accessible manner, in a way that's not too technical or too academicist, to say in that way.
Yeah,
So I think the digital library of the Caribbean, I think that has a lot of potential, and I think I will be using it in the future for research of my own. But overall, I think projects like these are very important, because I mean, the most logical thing, the most obvious thing here is I don't have to travel to Panama if I want to see a certain book that they have in their library. I don't have the National Library in Panama, but you can have
yeah,
access to that through the digital library of the Caribbean, which is awesome. So that way you're
it
cutting a
is.
lot of costs, you're cutting a lot of time traveling, all that stuff, and I think that's very useful. So yeah, I will be hopefully having conversations with the folks that manage the
Yeah.
digital library of the
And I don't
Caribbean
know if
soon.
in your audience also there may be people who work in the cultural field, like in musea, etc. And
Mm.
it's important. We didn't discuss that, but initiatives like DLOG, well, and I think DLOG first and foremost have helped so much in conservation of vulnerable
Mm-hmm.
material. And of course, our heritage material is vulnerable wherever you are in the Caribbean because of the climate and very often the monetary situation. So that's something people can bear in mind as well. If they have a small museum or collection, private or whatever, of pictures of something, then this is a wonderful place to share that. and to take care of conservation as well. And DLOC prides itself in being able. It's not just pride, but they were very, very happy to be able to go to Haiti very soon after that dreadful earthquake in 2010. They were there as one of the first institutes to help, and they were focused on taking care of all the archival materials that they could find and try to digitize that. So Haiti received a huge collection of digitized material that was very, was either on the brink of, destruction or, yeah. So that's something mentionable as well.
Well, thank you very much for this conversation so far. I think it's been a very nice experience to learn about the Dutch Caribbean, and also to learn about initiatives such as the Digital Library of the Caribbean. It's been great talking to you today. I think it expands the perspective of my audience, who, those people who may not know that there are other places in the Caribbean that are very similar, but at the same time our cultures are very different too as well.
Wonderful experience. Thank you so much, Ramon, for organizing this, not just this one, but for having this wonderful platform. So congratulations on that.
Thank you very much again, and this has been a new episode of Archipiélago Histórico.